In such an age I dwelt on earth, when men had fallen so beneath their nature that they, unbidden, for their lust would kill, and foaming stagger in the tangles of confusion, possessed by tainted creeds, bewildered by delusion. In such an age I dwelt on earth, when spies were honored, and the murderer, the traitor, and the thief were held as heroes. But he whose zeal, it seemed, lacked voice and violence, would be abhorred as if he bore a pestilence. These lines, by a young Hungarian poet, written shortly before he was murdered by local militia in late 1944, sum up a world that to many of us seems to represent an inversion of morality. Those who persecuted Jews, who betrayed them, who killed them, they were rewarded. Those who showed compassion toward them were shunned. Those who shielded them endangered themselves, and many of them paid a high price for their altruism. In this lecture, we begin to explore the world of the Holocaust. Our subject today is the three major groups of non-Jewish Europeans in terms of their relationship to the Holocaust and to the Jews. We will discuss the altruists or rescuers, those who work to protect the Jews, and a far larger group, the bystanders, who neither assisted the Jews nor assaulted them. But first, let's examine the perpetrators, the group of people who directed, facilitated, or participated in the killing. The first group that we will consider is sometimes referred to as desk murderers. It included bureaucrats, clerks, and others who helped to engineer the final solution without participating directly in the killing. To many, Adolf Eichmann has seemed the quintessential desk murderer. When on trial in Jerusalem, he maintained, "I never killed a Jew, and I never gave an order to kill," although he admitted aiding and abetting one of the greatest crimes in the history of humanity. Hannah Arendt, in her famous report on the trial, commented, "It would have been very comforting indeed to believe that Eichmann was a monster. The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were terribly and terrifyingly normal." In Eichmann, Arendt saw the banality of evil, the triteness of it. She depicted him as an unambitious, unimaginative bureaucrat who was oblivious of any moral implications in the work that he was doing and had as his sole ethic the drive to obey orders. There was certainly more to him than this. More than any other individual, Eichmann coordinated the death trains, and he pressed for a rapid pace in deportations. As head of the Jewish Affairs section of the Gestapo, he demanded meticulous reports on the death campaign. Indeed, the figure of 6 million Jewish dead was initially drawn from his own estimate, reported at Nuremberg by a subordinate of his. Anyone of Eichmann's stature did not simply follow orders, he gave them. Nevertheless, there were undoubtedly other bureaucrats who did fit the mold fashioned by Arendt. Heading the true desk murderers were officials of the governmental agencies that shared aspects of management of the complex process of ghettoization, transportation, and liquidation. There were constant turf wars among these men as they attempted to increase the power and prestige of their respective agencies, and often the turf involved was their share of control over the eradication of the Jews. Especially for the SS leadership, political considerations were huge. So long as the killing campaign was proceeding smoothly, they could count on Hitler's support. Besides the directors, every branch of government included many bureaucrats and clerks, who in carrying out their assignments made millions suffer. Typical of this type were the personnel who scheduled the death trains. Akin to the desk murderers were the corporate leaders who exploited the final solution to increase their profits, especially by using Jews and others as slave laborers. Many professionals, especially engineers and scientists, likewise played a large part in the war against the Jews. By no means were all perpetrators ignorant thugs. A majority of the bureau chiefs who attended the Wannsee Conference of January 1942, which dealt with the strategy of extirpation, had PhDs. Another PhD was Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi Minister of Information and Propaganda, who helped keep German anti-Semitism at a fever pitch. Among the professionals who involved themselves in the Holocaust, few were more significant as a group than were the Nazi doctors. The best known of them, Joseph Mengele, presided over the selection process at Auschwitz, deciding by a flick of the wrist which Jews might live a while longer and which would be gassed immediately. Mengele also conducted experiments on Jewish and non-Jewish prisoners. Often he used sets of identical twins, and when he felt the need, he had no compunction about ordering that a child be killed so that he could dissect the body. Often the experiments were performed in the name of racial science. He appears to have had a special interest in the issue of what distinguished Aryans from inferior races, and in one experiment he injected blue dye into the dark eyes of several children, hoping that the eyes would themselves turn blue, the Aryan ideal. But Mengele was not alone, for many doctors had programs of investigation. Himmler himself had an interest in racial science, and when in 1942 August Hirt, the director of anatomy at the Reich University in Strasbourg, complained that he had too few Jewish skulls for his collection, SS officers moved into action. Soon 115 men and women at Auschwitz, 109 of them Jews, were selected by one of Hirt's colleagues. They were then gassed at another camp and were decapitated. Hirt had his specimens. The investigations by Mengele and by Hirt and others serve to indicate just how cheap Jewish life was to the Nazis during the Holocaust. Indeed, Nazi ideology and propaganda were crafted to make it easy to kill Jews. As portrayed to the public, the Jew ceased to be a human being, while at the same time he appeared ever more dangerous. Hitler himself often likened Jews to poison, vermin, maggots, cancers, and microbes. Equating Jews with pathogens, with disease causers, was not new. Decades before, the German Paul de Lagarde, whose anti-Semitic writings were to be popular with the Nazis, had referred to Jews as vermin, adding, "With trichinae and bacilli one does not negotiate. They are exterminated as quickly and as thoroughly as possible." The sense that Jews were not really human beings, but were rather lower life forms that were loathsome and dangerous, encouraged Germans to consider their destruction acceptable, even necessary. This cartoon reflects yet another level of dehumanization of the Jew. Now, the Jew is merely a germ under a microscope. There are other germs, by the way, in this slide: homosexuals, Britons, Russians, and Americans, who are represented by other symbols. During the war, a Nazi doctor was asked how, being bound by medical ethics, he could participate in a program of torment and mass murder. He responded, "Of course, I am a doctor, and I want to preserve life. And out of respect for human life, I would remove a gangrenous appendix from a diseased body. The Jew is the gangrenous appendix in the body of mankind." To move on to another group, which, though fairly small in numbers, played a decisive role in the torment and the deaths of countless Jews. One can talk about the camp commandants, especially those of the death camps, and what to them was just the routine of extermination. We may begin with this man, Rudolf Hess, the commandant at Auschwitz, who presided over the deaths of more individuals than did any other architect of the final solution. Even Hess claimed claimed that because he was in command, he had been forced to be hard and to execute orders without demur. He commented, "I had to watch coldly while the mothers with laughing or crying children went into the gas chambers. I had to watch hour after hour, and by day and by night, the removal and burning of the bodies, the extraction of the teeth, the cutting of the hair, the whole grisly, interminable business. I had to look through the peephole of the gas chambers and watch the process of death itself, because the doctors wanted me to see it." Another superintendent of death was this man, Franz Stangl, the commandant at the death camp of Treblinka in 1942-43. Like Hess, he later claimed that coping with his assignment had been difficult. Shortly before he died in prison in 1971, he told an interviewer, Gitta Sereny, that the worst place at Treblinka for him had been the undressing barracks. "I avoided it from my innermost being. I couldn't confront them. I couldn't lie to them. I avoided at any price talking to those who were about to die." Undoubtedly, many of the perpetrators were blindly obedient. Hess may be a case in point. While in custody after the war, he was interviewed by an American psychologist who reported there was no indication of emotional reaction of any sort, as he calmly related how he had received and executed Himmler's orders to exterminate Jewish families by the trainload. But possibly not even he was just a robot. As he was awaiting trial for war crimes, a trial that would result in his hanging at Auschwitz in 1947, he wrote a memoir in which he tried to show that he too had a heart and that he was not evil. In his memoir, which I've already quoted from and will do several times again, he claims that he had sympathy for those that were murdered on his orders, but that a sense of duty and a loyalty to the Nazi party, philosophy, and state compelled him to play his large part in the killing process. As portrayed by Sereny, Stangl comes across as somewhat more complex. On several occasions, he told Sereny that he detested the killing and the role that he had to play in it. To overcome his initial aversion to the killing, he added, he had resorted to drink. Later, however, he had begun to think of the victims as cargo. Like the Nazi doctor who likened the Jew to a gangrenous appendix, Stangl dehumanized his victims. In the same series of interviews, Stangl dealt several times with the problem of why, if he found his assignment so repugnant, he did not seek to avoid it. He acknowledged that some men had declined killing assignments and had not themselves been killed. But he added, I knew that it could happen that they wouldn't shoot someone, but I also knew that more often they did shoot them or send them to concentration camps. How could I know which would apply to me? On another occasion, he was asked why he did not communicate to subordinates at Treblinka his sense that the killing enterprise there was evil. Responding, he insisted, if I had made public what I felt and had died, it would have made no difference, not an iota. It would all have gone on just the same as if it and I had never happened. In these comments were two rationalizations offered by many perpetrators. First, that they had to follow orders or suffer severe punishment, and second, that if they complained or disobeyed, they would be sacrificing themselves for nothing, because others would simply step forward and carry out the assignment. During Nuremberg trials and after the war, a number of defendants claimed that their involvement in crimes against humanity came only because they followed orders. The result was a fascination with the question of what might cause an individual to follow orders blindly. A number of explanations were put forward, and several experiments were created that purportedly tested how a subject might be compelled to obey authority. The most famous of the experiments was devised by a young Harvard psychologist, Stanley Milgram, in 1961. Milgram created his experiment after reading accounts of Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem, where the defendant constantly deflected responsibility for the killing of the Jews by claiming that he was just a small cog in a vast machine and had merely followed orders. Through his experiment, Milgram sought to determine how credible Eichmann's defense was. Here we see a depiction of the experiment. The test subject is the one designated teacher. He is a student in a psychology course and has been told by the instructor, marked here as the experimenter, that in order to complete the course, he must participate in an experiment about teaching. The teacher is shown into a room. Through a window, he can see a student who is fitted with electrodes. His instructor tells him that he must impart certain information to the student, then test him on it. If the student makes an error, the teacher must repeat the correct information, then retest. If the student again makes an error, the teacher must not only give him the information again, but also press a button that will give him a mild shock through the electrodes. Each time the information must be repeated, the shock will become stronger. In fact, the electrodes are not live, and the so-called student is in on the experiment and is just acting. But, of course, the teacher does not know this. For his part, the so-called teacher may well at first refuse to take part, but he is likely to change his mind when the instructor reminds him that if he does not assist in the experiment, he cannot complete the course. Likewise, the teacher may well be reluctant to shock the student at first and will do so only when the instructor orders him to. But according to Milgram's data, most of his test subjects did eventually give in, and some continued on even when the so-called student appeared to be in great pain and begged them to stop. Because of the high stress associated with the Milgram experiment, it has largely been abandoned. But for a decade or more after Milgram introduced it, it was widely performed throughout the United States and Europe. And it was commonly cited as a valid test of what people could be made to do, even on the basis of modest coercion, getting through a course in this case. The experiment was thought by some to be relevant to understanding why so many Germans were willing to assist in killing the Jews. Despite the only following orders defense, however, and despite the protestations of men like Hess and Stangl that theirs had been a difficult duty, it appears that generally it took little persuasion to cause men to kill the Jews. Testimony given in Hamburg during the 1960s underscores this point. At issue was the fate of several former SS officers who were accused of having committed war crimes in German-occupied Poland in 1942-43 while heading an order police battalion, a German unit that was intended to maintain control over occupied territory. About 220 veterans of the battalion made statements prior to the trial. In particular, they spoke of the first time that they were called upon to kill, a day in July 1942, when, one by one, they shot about 1,500 Jews, most of them women and children. A number of the witnesses recalled that after their commander had told the men of the orders to liquidate, he had promised that any older man who was unwilling to participate would receive alternative duty. Despite this offer, only one officer and about 12 men had asked to be excused. Explaining the fact that so few had withdrawn, some of the men giving statements said that members of the battalion had hoped for advancement within the Corps and had felt that they would be jeopardizing their careers by backing out. Others claimed that they had been fearful of being considered cowards or unmanly if they refused to join in the shooting. Some men who withdrew, they claimed, had in fact been verbally assaulted by officers and comrades. After the killing had gotten underway and members of the battalion were leading women and children into the forest, shooting them and then going back for others, we do find that more men withdrew. But probably they, plus those who had earlier refused to participate, comprised no more than 1/5 of the unit. Some men found ways to rationalize what they were doing. One man in his later testimony recalled the case of a comrade who had acted in concert with another member of the battalion. The other man had killed the women, and then he had shot the children, rationalizing his action by thinking that these children could not survive without their mothers. Still, it appears that at the time, many of the men were upset by what they had been asked to do. But their resentment seems to have faded over time, and during 1942-43, the battalion received a number of orders to kill Jews or to round them up for transportation to the death camps. In the end, it was responsible for about 90,000 deaths. The history of this battalion, and especially of its first act of mass murder, calls into question several commonly heard generalizations about perpetrators. Most men of the battalion seem to have been reasonably stable family men. They were not apparently sadists nor psychopaths. As regarded obedience, members of the battalion did conform to the Nazi model, and this helps to explain that although the commanding officer explicitly offered them the option of removing themselves from the killing process, only a small minority did so, most instead accepting the assignment readily or bowing to peer pressure. It may not have been uncommon for men to be given a choice. Even in the Einsatzgruppen, which were so often ordered to commit murder on a massive scale, this may have been the case. When Otto Ohlendorf, former commander of Einsatzgruppe D, testified while on trial in 1948, he recalled, "I had sufficient occasion to see how many men of my Gruppe did not agree to this order in their inner opinion. Thus, I forbade the participation in these executions on the part of some of these men, and I sent some back to Germany." His adjutant corroborated this testimony, asserting, Ohlendorf announced to the Gruppe that particular individuals were unfit for the performance of such tasks, and therefore were to be released. Even when no choice was allowed, there were some Germans in uniform who refused to obey orders to kill Jews or other civilians. In such cases, there were generally no negative repercussions, though generally did not mean always. Those involved in the killing process could also salve their consciences, assuming that salve was necessary, with the notion that they were doing their duty as good citizens. During the war, in fact, Nazi officials directing the final solution constantly emphasized the importance of following orders, even when to do so was painful. Not surprisingly, the SS leadership was especially blunt on this issue. In October 1943, Himmler told an assembly of SS officers, "It's one of those things that it's easy to talk about. The Jewish race is being exterminated," says one party member. "That's quite clear. Most of you must know what it means when 100 corpses are lying side by side, or 500 or 1,000. To have stuck it out, and at the same time, apart from exceptions caused by human weakness, to have remained decent fellows, that is what has made us hard." The SS preached not only the word of discipline, but the dogma that the Jew was the towering enemy of Germany. Of course, this perspective was not only put forward in the SS, but it was a staple of Nazi propaganda. Furthermore, during the war, when most Germans banded together in support of the nation, this propaganda may well have become more effective. The circumstance of war tends to tighten associations. The Germans looked for friends, mainly within their nation, and they became more hostile to those that were defined by their leaders as the enemy. And there was no enemy as well defined in the national consciousness or by the party leadership as was the Jew. As is reflected in this cartoon, even during a war against Britain, the United States, and the USSR, the Nazis still portrayed the Jew as the ultimate enemy. Propaganda like this encouraged Germans to be ruthless in their treatment of the Jews, and the campaign of Jew hatred was particularly intense within the SS, which in one way or another was associated with most of the killing. So it was not just a matter of discipline or following orders. Those who killed the Jews were encouraged to think that by doing so, they were protecting Germany. But this explanation goes only so far, in explaining the willingness of many Germans to participate in the killing. It may be reassuring to believe that those who killed the Jews were robots who had been brainwashed into blind obedience, or that they were psychotics. Either characterization leaves untouched a generally positive sense of human nature. But the evidence doesn't support these depictions. Time and again, the sources tell of camp guards and SS men tormenting Jewish prisoners to no other end but to derive pleasure. They bashed in the heads of babies or told mothers to choose which of their children would die. Randomly, they murdered Jews. Randomly as well, they pointed guns at them, then purposely shot a little wide and laughed as they saw terror in the victim's face. Only following orders? By no means. Psychotic? In some cases, probably so. But psychosis, however we define the term, is an abnormality. And it does not appear that by and large the perpetrators were abnormal. Many photos of the killers at work are extant, usually taken by the Germans themselves. Sometimes the killers appear businesslike as they shoot their victims, usually in the back. In other cases, they are smiling. So many smiling as they stand beside the bodies of those who have been shot or tower over kneeling men and women who will soon be dead. Psychotic? No, there is no evidence of this as a mass phenomenon. The killers were not a few abnormal individuals. For the most part, they appear to have been the terribly and terrifyingly normal type that Arendt saw in Eichmann. Although probably not as numerous as the perpetrators, there were Europeans who, during the Holocaust, worked to protect the Jews. Those who provided help did so for various reasons. Some were motivated by greed and aided Jews who could pay handsomely. In many cases, these same people betrayed the Jews when their money ran out. Likewise, taking advantage were religious communities, especially convents, that took in Jewish children and then, while offering protection, sought to convert them to Christianity. But there were also the individuals and communities that offered help without expecting compensation, often at great risk. These, the altruists, or as they are sometimes called, the just of the nations, or the righteous Gentiles, were to be found throughout Europe, though more commonly in some regions than in others. Many surviving altruists have been interviewed, and the conclusions of the interviewers are not always what one might expect. We might think that, well, these were men and women who were assisting Jews who were friends or close acquaintances, well known to them. That seems not generally to have been the case. One study, for example, concentrates on 189 Polish altruists. Just 9% in this sample said that they helped only friends, while most of the rest claimed that they mainly aided slight acquaintances or total strangers. Other research on altruists has shown similar patterns. So, if not friendship, what drove the altruists? Sometimes it was a strong aversion to Nazism that caused them to look with favor on the group that suffered most from Nazi oppression. But generally they were moved less by hatred of the Nazis than by compassion for their victims. Above all, there was a shared sense among the altruists that, for whatever reason, they simply could not turn away from those who so desperately needed their help. In 1942, even as German occupiers and their accomplices were beginning to round up Jews for deportation from the Netherlands, Peter Medema, a Dutch minister, encouraged his congregation to visualize what for some of them would soon be real. Imagine that someone knocks on your door, and that someone is a mother with a small child, both sporting the yellow badge of shame. They are seeking shelter from the sharp teeth of the Nazi wolf. Both look deeply into the panic-inflamed eyes of the mother, and then imagine the wolf carrying off the child. Then decide, will I shut my door to these creatures, or will I usher them into my home and, if need be, share with them my bed? Once you come to a decision, go to sleep. If you wake up happy and refreshed, you have made the same decision I have. If you have a disturbed, restless night, possibly even a nightmare, you chose the worst solitude a man can discover, his own exclusion from the family of man. Because if you opt against opening your home and heart to an innocent fugitive, you have no place in the community of the just. Although for Medema the choice was clear, shielding Jews was difficult and dangerous. One of those who chose to help the Jews and who paid with his life for that decision was Anton Schmidt, a German sergeant who is credited with having saved 250 Jews in Lithuania in early 1942. His activities were discovered, and in April he was executed. By way of explaining his motives, we have only a bit in a letter that he wrote to his wife. You know how it is with my soft heart. I could not think and had to help them. In the year 2000, the German government honored Schmidt by renaming a German army camp after him. As Schmidt's case suggests, assisting Jews was risky. This was notably so in Poland, the country that was treated most harshly by the German occupiers. There, individuals and their families were sometimes executed for no other offense than having protected a Jew. Outside Poland, the penalties were typically less severe. On the other hand, many who were found to be sheltering or aiding Jews were sent to concentration camps, including one of the men who had helped to maintain the Franks during their 2 years in hiding. As might be expected, people in authority were able to do much to help the Jews, but those who did were often punished for their actions. Punishment for altruism might come in many forms. We find an early example of such help and of punishment in the case of this man, Paul Gruninger, who as of 1938 was the commander of police in a border district in Switzerland, when at the time that Germany annexed Austria. When this annexation took place, many Austrian Jews tried to flee into Switzerland, and the Swiss government tried to close the borders to these refugees. By falsifying papers, Gruninger was able to ferry in 3,600 Jews, most of them children. But when the Swiss government learned of his activities, he was dismissed from his post and stripped of pension rights. Only in 1970 did the government declare him rehabilitated, and it was not until 1996 that he was cleared of the charge of having been insubordinate. By that time, he was long dead. In 1971, just a year before his death, he was honored as one of the righteous by Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Center in Jerusalem. In recent years, historians have paid much attention to a small number of diplomats who saved the lives of tens of thousands of Jews while working independently and typically against the orders of their respective governments. One of these was this man, Tune Sugihara. As Japanese vice consul in Lithuania, he was based in the city of Kovno. The background to his story is this. After the German invasion of Poland, many Polish Jews had fled into Lithuania, which for its part was occupied by Soviet troops in July 1940. The Jews from Poland were in Lithuania illegally, and many were desperate to get out. So were many Lithuanian Jews, even though their situation was not as dangerous as it would become after Germany occupied Lithuania in the summer of 1941. In any case, beginning in June 1940, crowds of Jews began to congregate on the grounds of embassies and consulates in Lithuania, seeking exit visas. Like some other diplomats, Sugihara showed sympathy, and as a result, large crowds, and ultimately the largest crowds of all, came to be at the Japanese consulate. On 3 occasions, Sugihara wrote to the Japanese Foreign Ministry seeking permission to prepare exit visas for all who needed them. But the Foreign Minister insisted on restrictions that, if he had followed them, would have prevented him from issuing more than a handful of visas. Instead, he went against these directives and spent July and August of 1940 drawing up travel visas, perhaps as many as 10,000 of them. During these months, he often worked 18 or 20 hours a day, and he became so fatigued that his wife sometimes had to guide his hand so he could write. The explanation that he later provided for his decision to issue visas, despite the objection of the Foreign Ministry, was simple. They were human beings, and they needed help. I'm glad I found the strength to make the decision to give it to them. Threatened by the Soviets, the Japanese consulate in Kovno was closed in early September 1940, and Sugihara was forced to flee. Finally captured by the Russians in 1944, he spent 18 months in a Soviet prison camp, then returned to Japan in 1946. The following year, he was ordered to resign from the Foreign Ministry. The official reason given out was that the ministry was downsizing. But years later, Sugihara's wife reported that he had been told that his forced resignation was caused by his insubordinate act of issuing the visas for Jews in 1940. Another diplomat who aided many Jews was Aristides de Souza Mendes, here pictured with his friend Chaim Kruger, a Belgian rabbi who fled to France in 1939. De Souza Mendes was a career diplomat, and by the late 1930s he headed the Portuguese consulate in Bordeaux in southern France. Beginning in the fall of 1939, the Portuguese Prime Minister, or really dictator, Antonio Salazar, issued a series of orders sharply limiting the circumstances in which Portuguese diplomats could issue visas for most Jews. From the start, de Souza Mendes worked around these orders, but the real crisis came in June 1940. The German army was sweeping through northern France, and thousands of Jews were fleeing south. Many of them sought refuge in Spain, and it was mainly de Souza Mendes who secured it for them. Working around the clock during a 3-day span, June 17th to 19th, de Souza Mendes, his wife, and 2 children, plus Rabbi Kruger and a small number of refugees, drew up thousands of visas. They began by using standard forms, but when they ran out of these, they started to use whatever paper they could find. In the end, they were using wallpaper. De Souza Mendes then left Bordeaux. On hearing of what he had done, the Portuguese government declared the visas invalid and notified the Spanish border crossing stations of this. But de Souza Mendes learned of this and guided a long line of cars bearing Jews and other refugees to a remote border crossing. He guessed that the guards there had not yet been notified of the Portuguese order, and he was right. He himself lifted the gate, and the refugees were allowed into Spain, where they found sanctuary. All in all, de Souza Mendes is credited with having secured safety for about 30,000 Jews. Not surprisingly, when he arrived back in Lisbon, he was not welcomed by the government. In 1941, Salazar forced him to resign from the diplomatic service, and he also ordered that nothing should be done that might benefit de Souza Mendes or his family. He died much impoverished and with a ruined reputation in 1954. 12 years later, Yad Vashem honored him, noting particularly the testimony on his behalf by Rabbi Kruger, and since then he has received many posthumous honors. Besides diplomats, a group that produced some rescuers could best be described as the well-connected, individuals with a lot of contacts who were in a position to help. One of the noteworthy members of this group was Varian Fry. Fry was a Harvard-educated journalist and correspondent who visited Berlin in 1935 and was shocked by the persecution of Jews that he witnessed there. By 1940, he was based in Marseille, serving as an agent of a small group, the Emergency Rescue Committee. Working with a few friends and contacts, he was able to assist the escape of between 2,000 and 4,000 refugees, mainly Jews. Of particular use to Fry was the American vice consul in Marseille, Harry Bingham, who ignored State Department red tape and freely issued visas, largely on the advice of Fry. Several of the Jews that Fry and Bingham were able to ferry out of France were quite prominent, one of them being Hannah Arendt. Fry then returned to the United States, where he tried to spread the word about the Nazi campaign against the Jews. But later in life he became embittered over how little had been done to stop the slaughter. He did receive some recognition of his work prior to his death in 1967, but notice has mainly come since then. In 1995, Yad Vashem recognized him as one of the righteous. In this, he became the first American to be so honored, just as Sugihara was the first Japanese and de Souza Mendes the first Portuguese. Some altruists concentrated on protecting an individual or a single family, while others took part in underground movements that ferried the Jews to places of refuge. But as these last few examples have suggested, some individuals were in situations that allowed them to provide help on a massive scale. The most successful rescuer of all, Raoul Wallenberg, gave up the security of a comfortable life in Sweden. He was of a wealthy family there. Sweden was neutral. He could have sat out the war. Instead, he chose to travel to Budapest on a dangerous mission in 1944. There he took on the position of attaché to the Swedish embassy, with a particular mission to rescue the Jews of Hungary. By using certificates of protection and various other contrivances, threats, bribes, etc., whatever worked. He was able to save perhaps 70,000 Jews, mainly in Budapest, from deportation to the death camps. But his fate, like that of so many others, shows that rescue was a risky business. When Budapest was liberated, as they said, as the Soviets said, by the Soviet army in early 1945, he was, for reasons that are unclear, detained by the Soviets. He was removed to a labor camp within the USSR, where, according to Soviet authorities, he died in 1947. More than 3 decades before Western governments made a serious attempt to locate him. When pressed, the Soviets at first explained that he had died of a heart attack. But in 2000, a government official with inside knowledge reported that he had in fact been executed. In addition to individual altruists, there were a number of networks that were dedicated to helping Jews. Virtually every country in Nazi Europe included several such networks. In Berlin itself, there was a network, as well as a number of individuals who worked alone to aid the Jews. Estimates of the number of Berliners doing this work go as high as 20,000. In Poland, a group called Zygota was instrumental in rescuing 4,000 Jewish children. While all the men and women pictured here, some of them Jewish, most of them Catholic, played major roles in Jewish rescue, we might particularly note the woman in the top row, second from the right. This is Irena Sendler, who is particularly credited with having saved 2,500 Jews, and was recognized by Yad Vashem in 1965, being one of the first to be so honored. In a few cases, whole communities shared the work of protecting Jews. Many of the residents of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, a French village near the Alps, shielded Jewish refugees or helped ferry them to safety. And in the photo here on the right, we see several of the leaders of this act of defiance of the Nazis. These men associated with a Protestant church in Le Chambon. The most memorable case of community involvement came in Denmark. Realizing that military opposition was futile, Denmark in 1940 became a very unwilling ally of Germany. But despite German pressure early in the war, Danish Jews were protected from persecution. The Germans occupied Denmark in August 1943, and an order was given to seize the Jews for deportation. This roundup was planned for October 1st, but the Danish authorities were warned by this man, Georg Duckwitz, a German naval attaché in Copenhagen. Duckwitz, who would later be honored by Yad Vashem, also helped arrange for Sweden to accept Danish Jews who might be evacuated. During the last night of September 1943, the vast majority of Danish Jews, approximately 7,200, were ferried to Sweden. Many Danes knew about the evacuation, and a large percentage participated. About 400 Jews, who had in fact been left behind, were deported, but the Danish government even pursued their cases, made inquiries after them, and was able to win them comparatively good treatment. It does not appear that any Danish Jew was gassed. Aside from the relatively small numbers of individuals who lived in centers of altruism, most rescuers had to swim against the tide. In regions where anti-Semitism was widespread and intense, altruists could expect little support, and the threat of exposure was very real. Almost 90% of the test group of 189 Polish altruists that I mentioned before stated during the 1980s that during the war they had been fearful of exposure by neighbors. Indeed, a number of the altruists participating in this survey, in these interviews during the 1980s, even then refused to allow their names to be publicized because they feared the condemnation of neighbors, even almost 40 years after the fact. Even at best, rescue was hard work, and a slip-up could endanger both the Jews and their protectors. Most altruists shared their homes with Jews, secreting them away in prearranged hiding places when there was danger. Providing protection was somewhat easier in rural areas, both because homes were relatively isolated and because extra food was available in field and garden. But various studies indicate that a considerable majority of the altruists lived in towns and cities, surrounded by prying neighbors and limited to fixed rations. Often they had to steal food to feed not themselves but the Jews they were sheltering. Forgers to fabricate ration cards or identification papers were much in demand. In all, it appears that 500,000 Jews, perhaps 1 million, were saved by individuals, groups, or communities. Many more could have been saved had it not been for the indifference or hostility of the population at large. The Holocaust period saw a majority of Europeans stand aside, neither promoting the killing campaign nor doing anything to inhibit it. Finding evidence about bystanders is difficult. It's hard to read the minds of people who did nothing. We can see bystanders in photos like these. But what were they thinking? Undoubtedly, some bystanders wanted to help the Jews, but were fearful of consequences or were uncertain of what they could do to make a difference. Undoubtedly, as well, there were bystanders who did not realize what fate really awaited the Jews, who were being loaded into cattle cars. Nevertheless, the fact is that a high proportion of Europeans wanted the Jews out of their midst, and they cared little how this was accomplished. Bystanders they may have been, but they were by no means innocent bystanders. Here we see another side to bystanders. Yes, bystanders they may be, but they're joining in the mocking of these Jews who are being humiliated in Vienna in the late 1930s. And many of them were more active in this harassment, in really promoting the violence against the Jews than one finds here. A reflection of the attitude of a very high proportion of Europeans, notably in Central and Eastern Europe, can be seen in association with one of the best-known massacres of Jews during the war. On September 29th to the 30th, 1941, a German Einsatzgruppe murdered 33,771 people, almost all of them Jews, at a ravine named Babi Yar, near Kiev in the Ukraine. This photo depicts a group of Jews being herded out of Kiev toward the ravine. How can we be so precise about the numbers killed? It's because the commander of the group that killed them reported the details to Berlin. He added, the population scarcely knew that the Jews were liquidated, but the latest experience suggests that they would not have objected. He was probably right. Although there were some Ukrainians who tried to protect Jews during the Holocaust, and some who paid with their lives for this, the Ukraine had long been a center of Jew hatred. Furthermore, for a time at least, many Ukrainians welcomed the Germans, seeing them as having liberated their nation from the Soviets. It would have been surprising if many of them objected to the massacre at Babi Yar, much less that they tried to prevent it. Beyond the simple bystanders, there were the collaborators, who may not themselves have killed, but who actively supported the campaign of murder and abetted it, as by betraying Jews who were in hiding. These groups, like the bystanders overall, far outnumbered the rescuers. Many Jews who survived the Holocaust, and presumably many more who did not, shared a deep sense of betrayal. Some could tell stories of rescue or attempted rescue, and of individual non-Jews who aided them in some way. But the overwhelming sense, for many, if not most of them, was that, by and large, Europeans did not care about what happened to them. They saw non-Jewish neighbors, people that they had considered friends, turn their backs on them when they most needed help. Reviewing his own experience, Elie Wiesel observes, none of the just crossed my path during the war. None of our Christian neighbors in my small village of Sighet in Romania risked his life to take in, to hide, to rescue a Jewish friend or a Jewish child. I can never forget our last walk to the station, to the cattle cars. The town seemed surreally peaceful. Not sad at all to see us leaving, setting out toward the unknown.